when my mom died.
When my father died.
When my dad died.
When my grandmother died.
We each have choices for the end of life. What we leave behind and how we are honored reflects as much about our lives and ourselves as any other choice we make. Most of us can only think of two basic choices: be cremated or buried. There is much more to it than that.
How did our modern funeral system begin? Abby Burnett could tell us. She is a historian who has studied burial customs of the American South and has written a book about the Ozarks and their own traditions and taboos.
Because I thought burial in the Ozarks would be pretty straightforward. You die at home, you're buried, your neighbors build your coffin. This is how people were burying the dead, and it doesn't always make a logical sense, because people are using taboos, superstitions, customs, the culture that they brought here to the Ozarks.
There are plenty of people today that believe that the funeral industry has much to answer for and would rather do everything themselves.
My name is Jim Bates, and I'm with the Funeral Consumer Alliance and also the National Home Funeral Alliance. What inspires me about green burial is that it brings the family and friends closer to the event, and it makes it a lot simpler and more direct by having the opportunity to dig a hole yourself, put the body in there. So it's just closer to really what's going to happen is what's happened since people were on this earth. Commercial burial pushes away the family from the grief and the experience. And the metal boxes and the metal cars and other people hired to do that just pushes the family away and prevents them from expressing their feelings the way they choose to with a profound, life-changing event.
The Funeral Sciences program at Arkansas State University at Mountain Home services 4 other campuses via distance learning across the state and online students across the region.
I'm Matt Buell. I'm the Program Director for Funeral Science here at Arkansas State University at Mountain Home. I'm also a funeral director and a licensed embalmer. Traditional funeral services have served the public very well. In fact, I'm rather adamant about the fact that there are certain practices we've gotten away from. We're probably the most heavily regulated industry there is for the Federal Trade Commission. In 1984, a law was put into effect called the FTC Funeral Rule.
The FTC Funeral Rule reads like a funeral consumer's Bill of Rights. It would seem that the most common complaints about the funeral industry are covered in this 33-year-old law, explicitly, with severe consequences for infractions.
You don't see that in many other industries.
One of the things that has happened in the United States is death has become separated, that people die in hospitals or they die in nursing homes, and it's managed in a very clinical and cold kind of way. Certainly with the natural death and burial movement is the idea the person is home, the person is surrounded by loved ones, and people accept that this is a natural part of life.
I don't want a funeral because I sat through both of my parents' funeral, and as a child I know what that's like, and then I sat through the funeral of my first child, and I just don't want that for myself. So I told my husband, cremate me, and I don't really care what you do beyond that because I'm dead. And I know that sounds crazy, but that's just kind of how I think about it now.
It is the 3rd or 4th most expensive purchase you will make in your lifetime. House, car, college or not for the kids, and burying or cremating somebody.
In the official curriculum, we use the word traditional to refer to the practice of having embalming and then a visitation and then a funeral and then burial. The reason the funeral rule exists is so that consumers will buy and can buy what they want and only what they want. It's to do away with an older practice long ago when funeral homes would basically say, at our funeral home, a funeral costs $3,000, for instance. Whether you wanted it or not, you paid for embalming, a visitation, a funeral, burial, and everything that went with it. If they used limousines, you paid for the limousines. Well, the funeral rule did away with that. There's only one charge on the entire general price list, their general charges, that they can build their overhead into. Everything else is just like a menu at a restaurant. You can take it or not, everything else on there. So.
People will say, oh, that's morbid. That's going to be the obvious response to that. And having been in this volunteer work for 25 years, that's basically a trick from the industry. They want to make that subject morbid so that they can control you to do it their way and to spend as much money as possible. So I'm less morbid by thinking about morbid things.
Everyone has an opinion about funerals, but here's where we separate opinions and facts about the choices available. There are 5 legal methods of disposition of a human body: burial, entombment, cremation, burial at sea, and donation to science.
What you do as far as death rites or funeral rites or services or no services is, for the most part, independent of which of those 5 methods of disposition you choose. One of the most personalized services I've ever presided over also, a Harley-Davidson fanatic, hardcore. So in this very dignified funeral home chapel, we had a Harley-Davidson as the centerpiece of the service, complete with all of the memorabilia that went with it. It was wonderful, and the whole live to ride, ride to live got worked into the service itself too. People have had a visitation where they were put into a natural environment. One of the more famous ones is a Pittsburgh Steelers fan who was embalmed in such a way that the visitation had him sitting in his recliner with a remote control and a blanket over his lap and reruns of the Pittsburgh Steelers Super Bowl games playing on the television. And there's a lot of things you can do if you plan ahead.
The body of the deceased person is laid in fetal position. The capsula will then be planted in the earth like a seed. A tree chosen in life by the deceased is planted on top of it.
It is in our curriculum in at least 4 different places, the idea of green or greener methods of disposition. Absolutely, we have to bring it into the curriculum because it is a part of the business these days. It's definitely a part that is going to stay. It is the right choice for a lot of people. And when it is, we need to be able to provide it, period. And we don't go out and preach against it either. Generally, a green burial does not involve embalming, placement in an easily biodegradable container. Most of the ones I've seen allow you to take a native stone, one that was already there, and you can have a small surface polished into it and put someone's name so that you can remember where someone was buried.
Arkansas is one of a few states, and it's part of a new trend that allows biodegradable caskets. And be environmentally conscious. Vaults are not required in Arkansas.
People do keep coming up with more and more really good ideas to help with it, and I admire that. The idea of the tree seed pod, nice idea, but where can you do that? You're not going to go bury someone in the backyard legally.
Some people, of course, would like to bury relatives on their own property. Well, in Arkansas, you can't do that without having a registered cemetery. And that's why you see a lot of family cemeteries on individual properties. There is a state board of cemeteries here in Arkansas that can help you with that if you're interested in doing that.
Well, the minute the person has died, all the neighbors who are crowded into that bedroom, all of the church members, neighbors, anybody who can be there to help, and the family are there to witness the death. But the minute the person has expired, all those people now have got a lot of jobs to do because so much has to happen in a hurry, and it's labor intensive, and it's going to involve the community.
There's a home funeral in a bag, all right? Very simple. And so, and I tend to do it kind of Home Depot style, all right? Plug the holes, get the ice going. State law has things like what temperature it's supposed to be, all of that. Those laws are all passed by industry to try to exclude us or anything and all that. It's okay. I've said that the whole time I've been here. Don't worry about all that law stuff. They're just, it's just intimidation junk.
Generally speaking, you can do it yourself, but it is a difficult and detailed process, and you have to make certain that you are following the law. This is why a burial and death plan is important to form ahead of time, so that you can come consult an attorney or even a funeral home and speak to them about the steps that you need to take. Now, when taking things upon yourself, you're assumed to know the law.
He said he didn't have money for a funeral and didn't want her to be far from him. He said that was her wishes and that's the way he wants to be buried too. Kind of a tough deal, but we have to make sure there's no foul play, which we don't suspect. But the medical examiner will give us a report. It's actually a misdemeanor crime.
So you can still be prosecuted for violations. You can certainly take these steps. There are some things that you must be aware of ahead of time.
One word, autolysis. Your body right now contains enough microbes and enzymes to completely self-destruct. You are biodegradable, and you've brought your own biodegradable package with you. You carry it with you all the time. Anywhere you might die, there is already an army there waiting to basically decompose us.
Oh yeah. You'll see it on that front page, the ick factor. And I would be extremely negligent not to mention the ick factor. Every body's body is different. And there are diseases and cancers and things like that that make the body do things when it dies. There's purge. You know, it's just common sense. If it's GI cancer, colon or whatever, you got trouble down at the tailpipe end, maybe coming. Well, be negligent to say, hey, it's easy, it always works, and it may not all go perfectly. What we do in home funeral is just get a depends. It's not much comes out, and it takes care of both genders just fine. Slap that booger on there, one is enough, way plenty.
But after somebody dies, that takes as little as a day to start having those microbes get loose. And should those microbes get loose into the environment, the main thing they're going to cause are going to be digestive, probably problems at first. But once they start doing that, any number of anything you had in your body can start being transmitted. And you don't know what a body has.
My experience with my dad 4 years ago, same kind of deal. We had him at home on his, the bed that you're going to die on that they bring out, and we had a pizza party that evening, and the grandkids were like this tall at that time, and they go over and talk to him and put pizza up to his mouth, and and he was just over on that side of the room.
But it can be kept at home undisturbed naturally for 24 hours, and then you have to cool it. And that was part, in my conversations with the coroner this past week, his concern was like, well, who's going to regulate how cold?
And who's going to spank you if you don't? Right?
Yeah. The answer is it's not his problem and it's not your problem either. But anyway.
So, in planning your own death, in planning your own burial, it is a very smart decision to go and talk to some of these entities and speak to them about your burial plan and your death plan. Because yes, you can do it all from home. It is possible to do, but it is difficult to maneuver. It does take a lot of time, and you must be very detail-oriented.
Your neighbors have put their lives on hold. Your neighbors have stopped everything the things they need to do to help, and you want them to get back to their own lives as quickly as you can. And that brings me to my last thing I hadn't known, which has to do with the early days of the professional funeral industry. And that has to do with embalming in the home. Now, if you were an undertaker and you've been selling coffins on the side, you sell furniture and then you make some coffins, and now embalming is coming along. And oddly, one way they did this was they embalmed in the home. They would come to the house, put the person on either a cooling board like I showed you, or on the kitchen table, and they would embalm them in full view of all the neighbors so everybody could sort of demystify the process.
If possible, we only make one incision, and we inject the chemicals that we use into one artery, and every artery has a corresponding vein adjacent to it. So a lot of people think, do you drain the blood out of the body? No, but we displace the blood out of the body. Now it also involves doing disinfection of the outside of the body, putting the facial features and hands into a natural looking position. We actually disinfect the body 3 times, before, during, and after the actual embalming is taking place. And of course, formaldehyde is an excellent disinfectant. It's really nothing but H2O plus a C. It's a miracle that we discovered it. It does what we want it to do miraculously well, which is preserve bodies and disinfect them. And if it's treated with respect and carefully, it does it well. Now, formaldehyde in the environment is a problem. And if we had a lot of formaldehyde in the environment, it definitely is a carcinogen, and it can cause all kinds of trouble. But the amount of formaldehyde that's introduced into the environment from one embalming, it's a drop in the bucket compared to the amount of formaldehyde that is released into the environment every time we throw away one of these particle board tables like you're leaning on right now. But I believe that they should crack down on the particle board industry before they crack down on us. Just my opinion.
Arkansas does not require that you embalm a body. Natural burial is perfectly acceptable. There are some limits on how you bury the body and where you bury the body.
But it is mandated that funeral directors never imply that embalming is required by law, and in fact, we are instructed to make sure we disclose that it is not required by law. Now, every funeral home I know has certain conditions under which they will offer a public visitation and certain conditions under which they won't. Most of them require that embalming has to have taken place in order to have a public visitation. And you can see the logic in that. If you're going to allow virtually the entire general public, if they want to come by and come within 6 inches of a dead human body, it's probably a good idea that they have undergone embalming. And at this point, I'd like to tell you that the 3 priorities of embalming, in order from top to bottom, the 3 priorities are disinfection, then preservation, and then restoration. This might catch you off guard, but to be honest, the funeral science students are some of the most outrageous people on campus. They have one of the most active clubs. Obviously, they have the weirdest senses of humor. It's not the kind of campus where you'd expect there to be an actual embalming room or a morgue or embalming on campus. We're not going to be bringing dead human bodies in and out of our campus. But I was watching Mythbusters one night, one of my favorite shows of all time. And this company, Sindaver, had given Adam and Jamie a couple of Sindavers for a couple of their experiments. And they were explaining that the Sindaver has all the bones, muscles, blood vessels, skin, like a regular human body. And in fact, if you X-ray, CT scan, or MRI a Sindaver, they look exactly the same as a real dead human body would. Now, I don't subject her to harsh chemicals. Her embalming chemicals are actually made out of tempera paint. But she has a complete and total circulatory system. She has a heart that is exactly the right size for her. And if I inject embalming fluid, let's say in the carotid artery up here, it will drain back out of the jugular vein in the same area, just like a real thing. So I have an additional way of skills testing all of my students. Morticia has turned out to be way more useful than I even dreamed.
My preference is I like a dead body to look like a dead body because that's what it is. That's what I'm assimilating. I don't like the stuff and puff thing that they do with the embalming and the makeup and the blue and the lights, all that mess. Okay, that's personal bias.
But in general, if someone is being transported across a state line, most of the permits to transport that body across a state line involve them being embalmed. Airlines don't want to transport bodies that haven't been embalmed unless they're going to an organ donation place and they are refrigerated with dry ice, let's say. You have to take precautions.
Of course, in transporting a body, you are transporting potentially hazardous materials. So there are certain Department of Transportation requirements for transporting a body.
The one that affords the most versatility is cremation. Cremated remains, in the eyes of the law, are no longer human remains. You can have them turned into jewelry. You can actually have them made into semi-precious gemstones. Any number of things.
2, 1.
You can fire them into space.
Launch of the SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket as NASA turns to the private sector to resupply the International Space Station.
Everyone may cope with the spiritual and psychological aspects of grief differently, but sometimes looking into history can give us clues as to why we share these funeral rites and traditions.
Probably a lot of people are familiar with the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She did research on both what it was like to face death and the stages that a person went through. And then she also discovered that those same stages were often found in people who had lost someone.
Well, graveyard rituals and taboos. First of all, today when you go to a graveside service, you don't see any dirt. They put it in a dump truck and they haul it away. Or they might cover it with a piece of astroturf, maybe, but mostly the dirt is removed. We don't want that as a reminder. There was also a stigma against dying alone. It was a terrible thing to think that somebody you love might have died by themselves. 1891, when the Benton County Democrat reported that the widow Martin had died suddenly and alone. Well, her son-in-law came boiling into the newspaper office the next day and he said, that is not true. And so the paper published a correction. Now, never get into an argument with a newspaper editor because they will have the last word. Taboos against digging a grave, you can't dig in advance. You dig on the day of the burial.
There are also people who are superstitious, who think that if they think about it and talk about it or plan for it, that it's making it more likely that it will happen or happen sooner.
You can't dig in advance. So even though the person is dying of something for which there is clearly no cure, tuberculosis, you'd think, build a coffin, make their shroud, dig their grave, and they don't do it because there are taboos. And maybe even more important is that you want to be there to hear the person's dying words. And the family wants to hear this too, because witnessing your loved one die was very important.
If more families would be present for death, there would be fewer taboos about death.
Ideally, you find some peace with looking back over your life and realizing what you've accomplished and feeling that it's time to go.
When families do that, sometimes that's how they want to end things. They don't want to have a visitation. Death went well enough.
I can't seem to think. What I'm thinking is that if I'd been riding with them, Bunny would have to be doing this. How could she? I can hardly do it. Ben looks after everything.
The barriers to people planning well and adequately for a funeral is primarily the American culture, the American way of death, is we all think that there's only one way to do it. It's pick up the phone and spend a lot of money.
There are certain notification requirements in Arkansas in the instances of certain types of death. What we normally would do would be to either call the sheriff's office and let them know, or call perhaps the county coroner and let them know.
And there's no hurry to call. You can wait it out to see if there's a do not resuscitate. You can wait till the next day to be sure. There's no emergency. If that person has slipped into a coma, you can't. If the minute of the recorded death is irrelevant, they died during the night, you can wait it out until you feel sure. You do not have to immediately call authorities to come rushing in with blue lights and sirens to determine that someone you fully expected to expire has drawn ever closer and somewhere in these hours began to lose their body temperature. So if you are present and you are there with the body waiting it out, you can vouch for that. And when you're ready, then you call.
When death occurs, it is a heart, soul, and mind event to you. To the rest of the system, it's a job. Guess who wins when push comes to shove? We do. I do it all the time. Hospital administrators, coroners, funeral directors, nurses, and that's how I explain it. They'll say, and I say, so you're telling me that your job and your job duties and your paycheck is more important than the feelings of the family and their desires. And I'll force them to, best I can, to answer that question because they know what the next event's going to be with them. If they go, my job's more important, I said, okay, now we're going to have some fun.
Okay. Certainly, certain entities, especially hospitals, do have policies in place for releasing a body because that body can indeed be a human health hazard. So those policies you are going to have to work around. Every person should have a plan.
Americans are infamous for not being prepared for death because the only place they see it is on CSI or Dexter or, some terrible imagery, and they don't have a realistic expectation.
I think funeral planning or advanced planning should start at 18. When a person becomes an adult, that's time to think about it. And you change your mind a little bit, you add, you take away from the plan, but all of that gives a much more comfortable, prepared feeling, and that's what I'm really looking forward to, is that last 5 seconds when I see the light and go, is to go, yeah, I did it the best I could, and that's fine for me because I'm gone in 5 more seconds, but my family has a plan and is prepared to take care of the rest of the process.
I've heard a lot of people say, when I die, I don't care, wrap me up in a sheet and throw me in a ditch. I hear that all the time, and I'm like, fine, but it's not about you.
Unfortunately, the dying person and the people who are left behind will often have very different needs. Families will often want to act as if it's not really happening. But I think ideally in the end, if people can talk together about what's going to be best for everybody, then that's the ideal situation. For a lot of people, having a place to go helps with the grieving process.
And I discovered the hard way after my stepson's biological father had died. He had the same wishes I had, and they scattered his cremated remains in a river. And the next time his birthday rolled around, which wasn't that far down the line, they wanted some place to go. But the river they had scattered him in is such a fast, he's not there. They really wished that there was a place, even though it's just his body, they would have liked to had some place where his name is on a plaque and his remains are, to go visit him.
A lot of dying people want there to be some kind of record that they were here.
You never know who's going to have a hard time grieving, but whoever that is has a place to go. I think that's a good thing.
You have no choice about doing it, but you do have a choice when you do it. You can do it now, tonight, together, or you can wait, and one of you will have to face it alone.
One of the things that make people not like funeral directors, if they don't, although I think we do have a generally very respected profession, but if people don't like funeral directors, they think it's because we're preying on these poor people who have just suffered a loss, like a bunch of vultures, and I mean all those kind of stereotypes. And I will tell you that the least favorite part of my entire job is the part where I have to ask them to pay the bill. I hate that. I hate that more than anything. If I could leave the money out of it entirely, I would.
When my mom died, that was my very first experience with death. I was only 5 years old. When we had her funeral, I remember going to that and everybody was crying, and I couldn't figure out why everybody wanted to look at my mom while she was sleeping.
Did you like your mom? Mm-hmm. When you're 5 years old, you always like your mom.
When my dad died a few years ago, before he died, we chose to do the funeral and the burial ourselves. On a Sunday morning, we put him in the back of my Tahoe. My brother and I drove up to Tulia, up to Amarillo, and parked out in the hotel. And we're gathering in the parking lot, and one of the guys plays bugle taps for veterans down in Houston. And he played taps echoing off the side of that hotel. And it was just, and I mean, everybody stopped coming in and out of that hotel, took their hats off, and without really knowing what was going on, but they could tell it was a moment. And went out to the cemetery, the hole was dug, no funeral director, well, one funeral director creeped up on us, and I'll
She's a spy.
Pardon?
She's a spy. She's a spy.
I have another word for it, but it,
When a year before my father died, he was diagnosed with both Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS, and Alzheimer's simultaneously. And I didn't make the arrangements. I turned him over to someone who does that all the time, every day, and just turned him loose. I found out that they had arranged to be entombed in a crypt in a mausoleum above ground. And very dignified, and it put him right outside the back door of the very funeral home where I work, so it was kind of nice to have him handy.
So then, about 8 years later, my father died when I was 13 years old. That one made a lot more sense because I was definitely old enough to understand death.
Yahtzee. We played Yahtzee a lot.
I love Yahtzee.
He liked to read.
I love reading.
We had lots and lots of books.
I love reading. I have a lot of books.
He watched TV.
I think everybody does.
I would say that one was probably far more traumatic for me because I was there when he died. He had a heart attack while he was driving the car.
When my grandmother died, she was terminally ill, but she had not seen a doctor in quite a while because she was 94 years old. At 94 years old, she had pain relief. She was comfortable at home, but we still had to notify because she hadn't seen a doctor within 30 days.
when I die, my plan is to do similar to what I did with my dad. I already have a pine box coffin put together with water-soluble glue. It has no nails or anything like that. I have the space picked out in the family plot where we have a lot of family members.
When I die, my arrangements include being embalmed, being dressed in my probably Drew Brees jersey. It's got to be New Orleans Saints. I'm to be put in a knotty pine, flat-topped casket, have a visitation, have a funeral that includes some conventional music and some unconventional, including crash test dummies. And then after that, though, Rather than go to the cemetery, I'm to be cremated.
I've made my wishes very known to my husband. I actually lost a child as well, and she died when she was 3 days old.
So this is the first picture we took with her right after she was born.
What are you gonna name it if it was a boy?
Andrew Michael.
Oh yeah,
We're gonna call him Drew.
name me Andrew.
Mm-hmm.
We were in a small town, and the coroner was also the funeral director, and he talked to us about cremating. And I didn't mind that thought that time, partly because I didn't know where I was going to bury my daughter, and I didn't want her to be in a place that I wasn't going to be for forever.
There's the box. That was mailed to me.
We kind of like put it in like a really special box.
Yeah, there's other stuff that we can do with it that I'll probably do at some point. And they put the date based on when they cremated her.
But it's because of that that I've made it known that I actually want to be cremated.
I would like there to be a place, that there's a marker. And I think that's probably because I'm really interested in ancestry history, and I'd like there to be something that, you know, in 200 years somebody can go back and say, oh yeah, there was this person in my family.
I don't want a service. I don't want people filing past my casket to look at my dead body. That's kind of weird that we're just going to walk by and, oh, look at the dead person, right? We make them look not dead and put them in this very expensive box, and then we all walk past him. And it's, to me, that's just very odd. That is now the last visual memory I have of both of my parents. And I don't want people to think of me when they think of April, and the last visual that they have of me is that.
There is great research to show that people who see a dead human body, their loved one dead after, in a visitation situation, they grieve in a more healthy manner than people who don't. Imagine a person whose child was lost in combat and they could never return a body. Or of course, the simplest example is 9/11. There were a lot of families that didn't get a body back to grieve over, and those people have a harder time grieving than people that actually see the body. I've learned the hard way, to some extent, also that all these different means of disposition have advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantage to traditional burial or entombment in a mausoleum crypt is that for the next years, they're there, and you may think about them being there, and you may wonder how they're doing there, you know, whereas cremation is instantaneous. So there's something for everybody.
We each have our own choice to make, one that is deeply personal for some, terrifying to others, and necessary for all. The most important part of this decision is making it for ourselves before the option is out of our hands and someone is faced with making the choice for us.
When I am dead, my dearest, sing no sad songs for me. Plant thou no roses at my head, nor shady cypress tree. Be the green grass above me, with showers and dewdrops wet. And if thou wilt, remember, and if thou wilt, forget. I shall not see the shadows, I shall not feel the rain, I shall not hear the nightingale sing on as if in pain. And dreaming through the twilight that doth not rise nor set, haply I may remember, and haply